This next section covers staff conduct and how we as educational professionals need to conduct ourselves appropriately. As professionals, we can affect the welfare of students in many ways. We need to ensure that we are aware of our verbal communication, body language, social interaction and physical contact with students. We need to be aware of how our verbal communication can affect student welfare. For example, it's not appropriate to give any personal views to a class, including religious or political views. It's not appropriate to be discriminative against any groups of students or other people. It's not appropriate to give personal information about yourself to a group of students or to individual students. We need to be careful that we are not using negative language about students. For example, if you need to address negative behaviour, talking about the behaviour is appropriate. However, talking about the student in a negative way is not. We need to ensure that we are not causing conflict in front of the class. For example, not engaging in arguments with students about their behaviour. We also need to be aware of our tone when communicating with students. For example, using a firm tone of voice as opposed to shouting at students, which would not be appropriate. As professionals, we need to be aware of how our body language impacts students. For example, making sure that we are not invading the personal space of children, not acting in a threatening manner, such as standing over students or blocking exits. We need to ensure that we're promoting a safe environment by using body language that shows that we're calm and in control. In regards to social interaction with students, it's important to maintain a professional relationship. You may be asked to oversee playtime or break time duties during the school day, and this is a more relaxed time to speak and interact with the students. But you are still an adult in a position of responsibility, and you need to make sure that you are not giving any personal information or opinions to the children during this time. You will need to build good working relationships with children during your lessons, but you must remember that you are their teacher and not their friend. This can be particularly important with vulnerable children, as they may struggle to maintain appropriate boundaries. In general, adopting a no-touch policy with students is the best way forward. However, occasionally, physical contact will be necessary with children. Particularly in the early years or in an SEN school, physical contact may be necessary to ensure the welfare of students. This might also be necessary if fights break out in any school setting. Touch policies will be in place and outlined in the safeguarding and behavioural procedures of these schools. Occasionally, schools will have a policy of shaking hands at the door to greet students before lessons, and again, this will be made clear to you if this is the policy of the school. Other than this, it's sensible to avoid any physical contact with students and be clear about appropriate physical interaction as outlined in the school policies. If you are at all unclear about the policy within the school, it is sensible to avoid any physical contact with students. Most safeguarding policies will state that any physical interaction with students needs to be necessary, proportionate, and appropriate. This usually means that you should only have physical contact with students if they are in danger of injuring somebody else, themselves, or seriously damaging property. We're now going to consider a case study about appropriate and inappropriate staff conduct. This case study is about Miss Smith. Whilst we are reading it, consider what went wrong. Could it be anything to do with her verbal communication, body language, social interaction, or physical contact with the students? How could we deal with this situation differently? A student arrived late to class and disrupted Miss Smith's lesson. The teacher told the student to stop making a racket and sit down. The student refused, and Miss Smith guided him towards his seat by putting her hand on his arm. When the student did sit down, he started rocking on his chair. The teacher approached and put her hand on the back of his chair to stop him from rocking. The student then rocked forward onto the floor and accused the teacher of first hitting him and then pushing him off his chair. Let's look at this scenario step by step and see how Miss Smith could have avoided this series of unfortunate events. When the student arrived late to the lesson, was it necessary for Miss Smith to deal with this in front of the class? She could have talked to the student one-on-one to avoid conflict. A better way to deal with this might be to give the student a specific learning target so they know how to continue with the lesson. The student refused to sit down, so Miss Smith guided him towards his seat by putting her hand on his arm. There was no need for Miss Smith to make physical contact with the student, as he was not in danger and he was not causing harm to anybody else. Just as we as adults don't want people invading our personal space, children do not want people touching them unnecessarily either. Miss Smith can quietly ask the student to sit down or show him what work will need doing rather than focusing on the negative behaviour. The student then sat down and started rocking on his chair. At this point, Miss Smith should consider the priorities within her classroom. Are the students learning? Are they focused on what they're meant to be doing? Do they have appropriate instructions? Ensure that everybody is taken care of and then deal one-on-one with a student who is causing issues. The teacher approached and put her hand on the back of his chair to stop him. The student might feel as though the teacher is invading his personal space and feel threatened at this point. There is no need for the teacher to put her hand on the back of the student's chair. She can simply use verbal language to communicate that she needs him to get on with his work and give him any assistance that he needs without focusing on the negative behaviour. The student then fell onto the floor and accused the teacher of hitting him and pushing him off his chair. In this situation, if an accusation is made against you, the best course of action is always transparency. You must make a written report of what happened and ensure the safeguarding leads within the school are made aware of this. Consider the welfare of the students. If somebody is ever injured in your classroom or in a space that you are supervising, you might also need to write up an incident report. In summary, here are a few things that you need to remember in regards to safeguarding children. You must have read and understood Keeping Children Safe in Education, Part 1. You need to know your school's safeguarding and behaviour policies. It is sensible to observe a no-touch policy at all times. You must know the data for your students. The more you know about them, the more you will understand about how to best care for them. Remember that you are already in a position of power in the classroom. You don't need to speak or act in a way that could seem threatening towards a child. If you are alone with a student, ensure that a colleague knows what's going on and that your door is open. If you are ever in a compromised position, for example, if an allegation is made against you, make a detailed written report and notify your line manager. Remember that transparency is always the best way forward. If a student decides to confide in you about the abuse of themselves or somebody else, encourage them to talk, telling them that you may write some notes but that you are listening. Explain that you may need to share the information with other adults to keep them safe and never promise to keep anything secret. Reassure the child that they did the right thing in speaking to you, and afterwards write up a report of the conversation and pass it on to the designated safeguarding officer immediately. You can find further information on your safeguarding responsibilities at the government website, at the CEOP website, at the Home Office website, where you can find an e-learning course on the basics of Prevent that we advise that you take. The NSPCC website and Childline also contain really helpful information about effectively safeguarding children. And you can attend face-to-face professional development courses at Prospero teaching offices around the country. You will now see the final question section followed by the evaluation. You need to make sure that you fill out the evaluation in full and reach the Submit button at the end of the course to ensure that your results are submitted for assessment. One of the training and development team will need to assess your responses and will notify you of your outcome as soon as possible. Thank you for taking this Prospero Teaching online course.